There is a list in the Bible that most people skip. It sits in Genesis chapter 5, tucked between the story of Eden and the story of the flood. And it reads like the kind of passage you move through quickly on your way to something more interesting. Names, numbers, dates. The kind of material that feels like record-keeping rather than storytelling. But do not skip it. Because buried inside that list is one of the strangest sentences in all of Scripture. And if you read it slowly enough, if you let the weight of what surrounds it settle before you get to it, that sentence will stop you in a way that a burning bush or a parted sea never quite manages. To understand why, you have to feel the list first. Adam lived 930 years, and he died. Seth lived 912 years, and he died. Enoch lived 905 years, and he died. Kenan lived 910 years, and he died. Mahalalel lived 895 years, and he died. Jared lived 962 years, and he died. Say it slowly. Let it land. 6 names, 6 lives measured in centuries. 6 times, the same rhythm, the same ending, the same 4 words, closing out a life that stretched across nearly 1,000 years. And he died, and he died, and he died. In a chapter full of extraordinary numbers, the most ordinary thing is also the most relentless. These men did not live for decades. They lived for centuries. They watched generations come and go. They buried their grandchildren. They outlasted entire civilizations. And still, at the end of all those years, the sentence was always the same. And he died. You begin to feel it after the 3rd or 4th name. The weight of it, the inevitability, the way the pattern locks into place so completely that you stop questioning it and start expecting it. Of course he died. Everyone dies. That is what the end of a life looks like. That is what the end of every life looks like. And then you reach the 7th name, and everything stops. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Read that again. Not he lived, not he died, not the familiar rhythm of a life measured and closed. He walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. No grave, no final breath recorded, no body, no burial, no ceremony, no mourning described, just a man who was here, walking, and then a man who was simply not here anymore, removed from the world in a way the text does not explain and does not try to explain. 1 sentence, quiet as anything in Scripture, and stranger than almost all of it. Now here is the question. Not where did he go? Not what does it mean theologically? Not what does the book of Enoch say, or what did the early church fathers think, or what is the correct interpretation of the Hebrew? The question underneath all of those questions, the one that does not go away no matter how many explanations you reach for. What kind of life ends like that? Not what kind of miracle, not what kind of divine intervention. What kind of life? What does a person have to be? Have to become? You have to spend 300 years building inside themselves and between themselves and God. That the ordinary ending of an ordinary life simply does not apply to them. That is the question we are going to sit with. Not to solve it, but to understand it. To follow one man from the world he was born into, through the morning that changed him, through 300 years of walking in a direction that almost no one around him was walking, through a world that was slowly forgetting what it was made to look toward, all the way to a sentence so quiet it almost disappears inside a genealogy. And he was not. This is the complete story of Enoch. Settle in. Chapter 1. The world Enoch was born into. Before we can understand Enoch, we have to understand the world he opened his eyes into. Not the theological framework, not his position in the genealogy. The actual world, the texture of it, The smell and the sound and the particular weight of the air in a civilization that had been accumulating for generations before he arrived. And here is where we have to be careful about a mistake that almost every retelling of this story makes. There is a tendency, when imagining the world before the flood, to picture something rough and unfinished, something barely human, figures in animal skins moving through a landscape that has not yet been named or shaped or understood. A world so far from anything we would recognize that the distance between that world and ours feels unbridgeable. That image is almost certainly wrong. And Genesis, if you read it carefully, tells you it is wrong. Go back one chapter, Genesis 4, before the genealogy, before the list of names and years, there is a different kind of record. A record not of how long people lived, but of what people built. Cain built a city, not a camp, not a settlement, a city. With everything, a city requires organization. Lavor, the kind of social structure that allows large numbers of people to live in proximity without destroying each other. That takes sophistication. That takes planning across generations. His descendants went further. Jabal raised livestock and developed the practices of animal husbandry. Jubal invented musical instruments, the harp and the flute, which means he understood acoustics and materials, and the relationship between physical structure and sound in ways that required genuine intellectual depth. Tubal-Cain worked bronze and iron, which means metallurgy, which means fire management and ore processing, and the kind of technical knowledge that does not appear overnight, but accumulates across centuries of careful observation and refinement. Now hold those details and add one more layer. These people did not live for 70 or 80 years. They lived for 700, for 800, for 900 years and more. If you imagine what becomes possible when a craftsman has not a single lifetime but 10 lifetimes to develop his craft, when a musician has not decades but centuries to understand her instrument, when a builder has not one generation but 10 to refine his methods and pass them forward, you begin to see a picture of the pre-flood world that is not primitive at all. It is extraordinary. It is a world of accumulated human depth that we do not have a good modern comparison for. A physician who has practiced medicine for 600 years. An architect who has been building and observing and correcting for 8 centuries. A farmer who has watched the same valley through 500 seasons and knows every variation of soil and weather and yield that the land is capable of producing. This was not a world of people who had not yet figured things out. This was a world that had been figuring things out for a very long time. And that matters for understanding Enoch. Because the world he was born into was not a world that needed more capability or more sophistication or more human achievement. It had those things in abundance. What was happening to it was something different, something quieter and in some ways more dangerous than simple ignorance or weakness. It was forgetting what it was for. Genesis 4 ends with a sentence that is easy to miss because it comes after all the impressive cataloging of human accomplishment. After the cities and the livestock and the music and the metalwork, the text pauses and says something unexpected. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Began to call upon. Think about that word. Began. As if calling upon the name of God was something that had to be restarted. As if there had been a period. A significant enough period that the restarting deserved to be noted. When the calling had gone quiet. Genesis is not saying people stopped believing. It is saying something more subtle and more serious. It is saying that the orientation of a civilization, the direction its attention naturally moved, the instinct that pulled a person upward rather than only forward or outward, had weakened enough that when some people in the time of Enoch began deliberately reorienting themselves, it was worth recording as an event. A world that has to be reminded to look up has already been looking down for a while. This was the world Enoch was born into. Not a world of cartoonish villains making dramatic choices to reject God. Not a world of darkness so thick you could see it from the outside. A world of extraordinary capability and genuine human beauty that was generation by generation. Letting go of something it had once held closer. Not throwing it away, just setting it down. Getting busy. Finding that the rhythms of daily life, the building and the planting and the raising of children and the burying of parents, filled the available space so completely that there was less and less room left over for the kind of attention that looks beyond what is immediately in front of you. Now here is what makes Enoch's world specific rather than generic. He was born into the line of Seth, not the line of Cain. That distinction matters, but not in the simple way people sometimes present it. This is not a story of one family of heroes and one family of villains. The line of Seth and the line of Cain were not living in separate worlds. They were neighbors. They shared the same landscape, breathed the same air, participated in the same civilization. The line of Cain had built that civilization in many of its most impressive forms, and the people of Seth's line were living inside it. What distinguished Seth's line was not superiority, it was memory. Specifically, the memory of something older than the city, and older than the music, and older than the metalwork. The memory of a beginning, of a garden, of a relationship that had been closer once, before distance began its slow accumulation. Seth's line carried that memory forward the way families carry things that matter imperfectly, incompletely, but persistently, passing it from hand to hand through the generations. Not always fully understanding what they were carrying, but knowing it was worth carrying. Enoch's father was Jared. His grandfather was Mahalalel. His great-grandfather was Kenan. Going back further, Enosh, Seth, Adam. The chain was not long. Adam had died only a little over a century before Enoch was born. If you do the arithmetic of the genealogy carefully, the first man, the man who had walked in a garden where the presence of God was not a matter of faith, but of daily experience, was still a living memory in the world Enoch grew up in. Not a legend yet. Not a figure so distant that his story had softened into something comfortable and symbolic. A man whose death was within the memory of people who were still alive when Enoch was young. Enoch grew up close to the beginning, closer than any human being who would come after him would ever be. He grew up in a household that remembered, that carried the thread, that had not entirely let go of the thing the rest of the world was slowly, without quite deciding to, setting down. And he grew up in a world that was becoming very good at forgetting. Both of those things were true at once. A boy shaped by memory, living in a world practicing forgetting. A child formed by a line that looked up, surrounded by a civilization that was learning to look only forward. Not hostile to what his family carried, not actively opposed, simply moving in a direction that did not require it. He was not special yet. He had not done anything that would distinguish him from any other person in his generation. He was a man of his time and his place, with all the ordinariness that being a man of your time and your place involves, but the world had given him something, without meaning to, that would matter later. It had given him the experience of living between two things, the memory his family carried and the forgetting his world practiced, the thread that ran back to the beginning and the civilization that was building its future without consulting that thread very much. Living between two things is uncomfortable. Most people resolve the discomfort by choosing one and letting the other go. Enoch had not yet made that choice. He was 65 years old when everything changed. And it did not change because of anything he decided. It changed because of a child. Chapter 2, the seventh from Adam. There is a number hidden in plain sight in Genesis chapter 5. Most people read past it without stopping. It does not announce itself. It does not come with a note in the margin or a footnote pointing you toward its significance. It is simply there, built into the structure of the list, waiting for the reader who is paying close enough attention to notice it. Enoch is the seventh name from Adam. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared. Enoch. Count them. 7. Now before we go any further, a word of caution that is also a word of invitation. What follows is not numerology. We are not going to construct an elaborate system of symbolic meanings and use it to make claims the text does not support. That kind of reading does more harm than good, because it replaces the actual weight of what the text is doing with a kind of cleverness that flatters the reader more than it honors the material. But we are also not going to pretend that numbers meant nothing to the people who wrote and preserved these texts, because they did not believe that, and the evidence is right there in the structure of Genesis itself. The world was created in 6 days. The 7th day was set apart, not because 6 and 7 are arbitrary labels for calendar positions, but because the 7th day carried a specific theological meaning: completion, rest, the moment when what had been made was declared to be what it was meant to be: holy. In a world where that week was the foundational story of everything, 7 was not just a number. It was a signal, a marker, a way of saying to the careful reader, pay attention here. Something is being completed. Something is arriving at the place it was always moving toward. The ancient world understood this instinctively, in a way that requires some deliberate effort for modern readers to recover. When a careful writer placed a significant figure at the 7th position in a list, that was not an accident of arithmetic. It was a choice, a way of preparing the reader for a departure from what had come before. And Genesis 5 is written by people who know exactly what they are doing with their numbers. Here is what the structure of the chapter looks like when you step back and look at it whole. 6 names, 6 lives, 6 entries following the same unbroken pattern: born, lived, had children, lived more years, died. The rhythm is so consistent, so deliberately maintained, that it begins to feel like the only rhythm possible, like the only way a life in this world can end. Then the 7th name, and the pattern breaks. Not loudly, not with an announcement. The text does not say, and now something different will happen. It simply shifts. The rhythm that has been building for 6 entries. The rhythm you have stopped questioning because it has never once failed to complete itself. Quietly fails to complete itself. And in the space where those 3 words should be, and he died, there is something else entirely. And he was not, for God took him. The writer of Genesis 5 understood that the power of that moment depends entirely on the build-up. If Enoch were the first name in the list, his departure would be startling but not structurally meaningful. It would be an oddity, a curiosity, something to note and move past. But he is not the first name. He is the 7th. And by the time you reach him, the pattern has established itself so completely in your mind that its absence hits differently. It hits like a door opening in a wall you had stopped believing had doors. Now here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The Epistle of Jude, in the New Testament, refers to Enoch specifically as the 7th from Adam. Not just Enoch, the 7th from Adam, as if that positional detail is part of his identity. As if where he stands in the line matters as much as what he did. Jude was writing for an audience steeped in the Jewish tradition. He was writing for people who had grown up counting, who understood that position in a genealogy was not incidental information, but structural meaning. When he calls Enoch the 7th from Adam, he is not providing a biographical footnote. He is invoking a category. He is saying this is the man who stood at the place in the line where something different was supposed to happen. And something different did happen. But there is another layer to the 7th position that requires a different kind of attention. Not the theological significance of the number itself, but the human reality of what standing at that position meant for a person actually living that life. Enoch was close enough to the beginning to remember it. We touched on this in the previous chapter, but it deserves more weight here. When you place Enoch at the 7th generation from Adam, you are placing him at a very specific distance from the origin point of the human story. Not so close that the beginning is his immediate experience. the way it was for Adam or Seth, but close enough that the people who had been present, or who had known people who had been present, were still alive, still talking, still carrying within them a texture of experience that later generations would only be able to inherit as story. Adam died when Enoch was roughly 65 years old. If the genealogical numbers are taken at face value, Enoch grew up in a world that still contained the first man. Think about what that means for the quality of the memory Enoch had access to. It was not the flattened memory of distant legend, where the details have been worn smooth by too many retellings and the people have become symbols rather than persons. It was the living, particular, specific memory of people who had been there, who could tell you not what the tradition said about the garden but what it felt like, from the inside, to walk in a world where what was lost had not yet been lost. Enoch stood at the last position in the line where that kind of memory was still available. After him, it would always be inherited, always at one more remove, always a little more like a story and a little less like a wound. He was the seventh from Adam, and that meant he was the last person who could have known what it felt like to be almost close enough to touch the beginning. That is not a small thing to carry. It shapes a person in ways that are difficult to name precisely, but easy to recognize in the quality of their attention. The person who is close enough to the source to feel the warmth of it even when they cannot see it directly. The person who carries a reference point that most people around them are living further and further from without quite knowing it. Enoch had that reference point. He had the memory of men who had spoken with men who had walked with God not as a matter of faith but of immediate, daily, sensory experience. And he lived in a world that was several generations into the project of building a civilization without consulting that experience very often. That distance, the distance between what he carried in memory and what he saw in the world around him, was the specific quality of discomfort that Enoch lived with before Methuselah was born. Not dramatic discomfort, not the sharp pain of visible conflict. The quieter, more persistent discomfort of a person who can feel a gap that most people around them have stopped noticing because they have lived inside it long enough to mistake it for the natural shape of things. He noticed the gap. For 65 years, he noticed it, and then his son was born, and noticing was no longer enough. Here is the thing about standing at the seventh position in a line that is counting toward something. You do not always know, from the inside, that you are the seventh. You do not always feel the structural significance of your own position. You are simply living your life. In the world you were given, carrying the things you were given to carry. But the structure is real whether you feel it or not. And sometimes, a moment arrives that reveals it. A moment that shows you not just where you are, but why you are there. Not just what you have been carrying, but what you were carrying it toward. For Enoch, that moment had a name, and the name was given before the moment was fully understood. Chapter 3. The year Methuselah was born. Enoch was 65 years old when his son arrived. That is not young, even by the standards of a world where people routinely lived into their 9th century. 65 years of ordinary life. 65 years of doing what people in that world did, working, building, participating in the rhythms of a community, watching seasons turn and children grow and elders slow and stop. 65 years of carrying the thread his family had passed to him. The memory of something older and closer than the world around him was bothering to remember, without quite knowing what to do with it. Genesis does not record anything remarkable about those 65 years. Not a single encounter with God, not a vision, not a dream, not a moment of divine instruction that set his feet on a different path. 65 years of life in the text gives us nothing. No conversion story, no dramatic awakening, no moment we can point to and say, there, that is when it started. And then his son was born. And after that, the text says something it has not said about anyone else in the chapter so far. Enoch walked with God. Those 4 words appear immediately after the record of Methuselah's birth. Not before. Not during some earlier season of spiritual seeking that predated the child's arrival. After. The timing is in the text, and the timing is deliberate. Whatever began in Enoch, it began in the year his son came into the world. Now we do not know what Enoch felt in the moment he first held that child. The text does not give us that. Scripture rarely gives us the interior experience of a moment, the specific ability of what a person felt when the thing that changed them arrived. It gives us the fact of the change and leaves us to sit with what that might have meant from the inside. But we do not need the text to tell us what becoming a parent does to a person. That is a human constant that requires no scholarly footnote. There is something that happens when you hold a new life for the first time that does not happen any other way. Not a sentimental thing. A reckoning. A sudden, unannounced confrontation with the full weight of what kind of world you are handing this person. What they will inherit. What they will have to navigate. What the trajectory of the world they are entering will require of them. Before a child, you can live with a certain amount of comfortable ambiguity about the direction things are heading. You can notice the gap between what the world was made to be and what it is becoming, without being urgently required to do anything about your noticing. The gap is real, but it is not yet personal in the most demanding sense of the word. A child makes it personal. A child looks up at you from the beginning of a life that will have to be lived in the world as it actually is, not as it might have been. And the question that you could previously hold at a comfortable intellectual distance becomes something else entirely. It becomes the question of a father, of a mother, of a person responsible for another person who cannot yet be responsible for themselves. What kind of world is this? And what kind of person do I need to become to help this child walk through it well? That question, in one form or another, is what Enoch faced in the year Methuselah was born. And his answer was not a program or a philosophy or a set of principles carefully developed over time. His answer was a direction. He turned toward God and began walking. Not away from the world. Not into some private spiritual enclosure where the noise of daily life could not reach him. He remained in the world, with all the responsibilities and relationships and ordinary demands that the world placed on a man with a son and a household and a community. He did not leave any of that behind. He just began walking through it differently, with a different orientation, with his attention pointed toward something that the world around him was increasingly good at not pointing toward, and he kept walking. For 300 years, he kept walking. Now, before we follow him into those 300 years, there is something about the name he chose for his son that deserves careful attention. Because Enoch was a man who had just begun walking with God, and the first act we have any record of from that new walk is the act of naming a child. The name he gave was Methuselah. The precise meaning of that name has been debated by careful scholars across many centuries. The Hebrew roots are old and not perfectly transparent, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that the debate has not been fully resolved. Anyone who tells you they know with certainty what the name means is telling you more than the evidence supports. But here is what the majority of careful readings share. The name appears to point toward something arriving, something being sent, something that would come at the moment this man's life ended. The specific form of the arrival, the specific nature of what would be released or sent or initiated at the death of the man who bore this name. The scholarship is genuinely divided on these details. What is not divided is the direction the name points. Something is coming when he dies. Later interpreters, reading the genealogical numbers with care, noticed that the year Methuselah died, according to the arithmetic of Genesis, was the same year the flood came. Whether that convergence is coincidence or calculation or the fulfillment of something Enoch knew when he pressed that name into his son's identity. The text does not say, the convergence is there. The meaning of the convergence is left, characteristically, in the silence that Genesis is so skilled at using. What we can say is this: a man who has just begun walking with God does not name his child carelessly. The world Enoch lived in did not treat names as decorative. A name was a statement, a compressed meaning attached to a person at the beginning of their life, intended to carry something true about who they were, or what their arrival meant, or what the person giving the name understood about the larger story they were all living inside. Enoch looked at his newborn son and gave him a name that pointed toward judgment, not with anger. That is important to hold. The naming of Methuselah was not an act of condemnation. It was an act of honesty. The honesty of a man who had just turned to walk with God, and whose first step in that direction involved looking clearly at the world his son was being born into, seeing where it was heading, and choosing not to pretend otherwise. There is mercy in that name, too. Because a name that says something is coming when this man dies is also a name that says something is not coming yet. Not while this man lives. Not for as long as this life continues. The patience embedded in that name is as real as the warning embedded in it. Both things are there at once. In the compressed language of a father who had just begun to see the world from a different angle, he saw far, further than most fathers are asked to see when they hold their firstborn. And now, before we move into the 300 years that followed, there is one more thing the text gives us about the year Methuselah was born. One more detail that sits quietly in the genealogical record, doing its work without announcing itself. Enoch lived 365 years. Not 900. Not 800. Not the numbers that surround him in Genesis 5. Lives measured in centuries, so long they begin to feel like geological formations rather than human lifetimes. 365 years. Against the backdrop of the chapter he inhabits, that number is almost startlingly short. But short is not the right word for it. 365 is the number of days in a year. One complete orbit. Every season visited once. Spring into summer, into autumn, into winter, and back to spring. A full circle. Nothing left out. Nothing doubled. Nothing extended beyond the natural completion of the thing. The text does not tell us what to make of that number. It does not pause to explain it or underline it or attach a commentary. It simply records it and moves on, the way Genesis records so many of its most significant details, with the quiet confidence of a writer who trusts the careful reader to stop here. In a chapter where men lived 900 years and still arrived at the same ending, Enoch's 365 does not feel abbreviated. It feels exact. It feels the way a circle feels when it closes without leaving a gap, not cut short. Completed. The year Methuselah was born was the year Enoch began walking with God. And from that year, 300 years remained. 300 years of a circle that had already begun its closing arc. We are at the beginning of that arc now. And the man walking it has just looked into the face of his newborn son, given that son a name weighted with the future, and turned in a direction that he will not turn away from for the rest of his life. 300 years. Let us follow him. Chapter 4. 300 years. From the outside. 300 years is not an abstraction. We need to stay with that for a moment before we move into what those years looked like. Because there is a tendency, when reading about lifespans measured in centuries, to let the numbers become decorative, to nod at them without actually feeling them, to understand intellectually that 300 years is a long time without doing the work of imagining what 300 years actually contains. So let us do that work. 300 years ago from the writing of this script, the world looked like this. There was no United States. The land that would become it was a collection of colonies under British rule, and the revolution that would change that was still decades away. The steam engine had not yet been invented. The germ theory of disease did not exist. The vast majority of human beings alive on Earth in that year would live their entire lives within 20 miles of where they were born. That is 300 years, one human lifetime. For Enoch, now take 300 years and place them inside a single continuous consciousness. One person. awake and present and accumulating experience for all of it. Watching not 3 centuries of history from the outside, but living inside 3 centuries of change, loss, growth, relationship, grief, joy, and the slow, patient work of a life that does not end when most lives end. What does a person become across 300 years of walking with God? That is the question this chapter is trying to answer. Not from the inside. Not yet. From the outside first. What did the people around Enoch see when they looked at him? What did his life look like when observed from the position of the people who shared his world? And the first thing to say is the thing that is easiest to miss. Enoch looked ordinary. Not ordinary in the sense of unremarkable or undistinguished, but ordinary in the sense that his life was built from the same materials as every other life around him. He had a household. He had responsibilities. He worked and ate and slept and rose and worked again, the way every person in his world worked and ate and slept and rose. The rhythms of daily life did not stop for him simply because he had begun walking with God. They continued, as daily life always continues, with their demands and their pleasures and their particular mixture of the meaningful and the mundane. He had a wife, though the text does not give us her name. He had sons and daughters. The text tells us that explicitly. Lives he participated in, forming and watching unfold. He had neighbors and a community, people whose names and faces were part of the texture of his daily existence. He had the accumulated network of relationships that 300 years of living in the same world, among the same extended community, naturally produces. He was not a hermit. He was not a mystic in isolation, sealed off from the ordinary business of human life. He was a man in the middle of it, and he was walking with God, both things at once. This matters because there is a version of holiness, a version that has appealed to certain temperaments in every religious tradition, that understands closeness to God as requiring distance from the world. The idea that to walk with God you must walk away from ordinary life, that the sacred and the daily are in competition, and the person who chooses the sacred must sacrifice the daily. Enoch's 300 years are a quiet argument against that version. He did not withdraw. He remained. He raised children in the world as it actually was, not in some protected enclosure insulated from the world's direction. He buried people he loved in a world that was practicing forgetting. He conducted business and resolved disputes and participated in the life of a community that was not, for the most part, walking in the direction he was walking. He did all of that, and he walked with God through all of it. Now here is something that requires imagination because the text does not tell us directly, but that the context of his world makes almost impossible to avoid. The people around Enoch noticed, not in the dramatic way of a prophet who stands in the marketplace and delivers thundering speeches, not in the visible way of a miracle worker whose deeds draw crowds, in the quieter, more persistent way that people notice when someone they know is consistently oriented towards something they cannot quite see. There is a quality that long faithfulness produces in a person. Not perfection, not the absence of difficulty or doubt or the ordinary friction of a human life. Something more like a settled groundedness, a quality of attention that is not easily disrupted by the things that disrupt most people's attention. A way of being present in a conversation or a crisis or an ordinary afternoon that carries the faint but unmistakable signature of someone who has been regularly, over a long period of time, in contact with something larger than themselves. 300 years of walking with God would produce that quality in a way that 20 years or 50 years could not. The people who knew Enoch in his first century of walking with God saw a man changing. The people who knew him in his second century saw a man changed. The people who knew him in his third century, if any lived long enough to span that distance, saw something harder to name but easier to feel. A person whose entire way of inhabiting the world had been slowly shaped, year by year and decade by decade. into something that reflected the direction he had been walking. Like a tree that has grown for centuries in a prevailing wind, the shape of it tells you everything about the direction it has been pushed and pulled. You can read the history of the wind in the wood. You could read the history of Enoch's walk in the person he had become. But here is what is important to hold alongside that image. The walk was not effortless. It was not a state he achieved and then simply maintained without continued effort. Walking is a verb. It requires continuous action. Each step is a choice. Small and mostly unremarkable, but a choice nonetheless. And across 300 years of steps, the choices accumulated into a direction so consistent and so deep that it had become something like the grain of him. Genesis captures this with the repetition of the phrase, Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years. The text does not say Enoch arrived at a destination. It does not say Enoch achieved a state of spiritual completion. It says he walked, present tense in the narrative sense. Ongoing, continuous. Not a single act of faith that he then coasted on, but a daily practice of orientation that he maintained across 3 centuries. That is not a small thing to say about a person. It is, in some ways, the most demanding thing you could say, because it means there was not a single long stretch in those 300 years when he stopped, not a decade when he set it down and picked it back up later, not a season of wandering followed by a famous return. Just the walk continued, year after year, through everything that 300 years of a human life contains. And human life, even for the faithful, contains difficulty. Enoch watched people he loved grow old and die. In a world where lives stretched across centuries, the losses still came, just more slowly and from a greater accumulated distance. He watched the world around him continue its drift. He watched each generation inherit the drift of the one before it and add to it, the way a river adds to its delta, incrementally and unstoppably. He watched the gap between the world as it was and the world as he understood it to have been made to be continued to widen. He watched all of that, and he kept walking. Now there is a specific quality of his walk that the outside view reveals, one that the text preserves in the very structure of what it says about him. Enoch walked with God, not for God, not toward God. With. The preposition matters more than it might initially seem. Walking for someone implies a task, a mission, a service being rendered on behalf of another who is elsewhere. Walking toward someone implies a distance that has not yet been closed, a destination not yet reached. Walking with someone implies accompaniment, presence, a shared movement through shared space and shared time. Enoch was not performing a spiritual service for a God who watched from a distance. He was not striving toward a God who remained perpetually just out of reach. He was walking alongside, in company, in the daily, unremarkable, quietly extraordinary intimacy of 2 persons moving through the same world in the same direction. That is what the people around him saw, even if they could not have named it. A man who was never quite alone. A man in whose company you occasionally had the unsettling and clarifying sensation that there was more present than you could account for. A man who seemed, in some way that resisted simple explanation, to be in conversation with something that the ordinary texture of daily life did not include. His children grew up with that quality in their father. They did not grow up with a man who talked constantly about God, or who turned every meal into a sermon, or who held his family at arm's length from the world because the world was too corrupted to be touched safely. They grew up with a man who walked, who was present in the full human sense of the word, available and engaged and genuinely there, and who was, simultaneously, always oriented, always facing a direction that the world around him was slowly turning away from. What do you absorb when you grow up in the household of a person like that? You absorb the direction, not as doctrine, not as a set of propositions about the nature of God that can be recited on demand. as something more like a posture, a way of standing in the world, a way of allowing the larger questions to remain genuinely open, rather than closing them off with whatever answer is most immediately available. Methuselah grew up in that household. The son, whose name already carried the weight of what was coming, grew up watching his father walk toward the source of that weight with steady, daily faithfulness, watching him carry a name, a direction, a quality of presence that was different from what the world outside their household was practicing. What Methuselah learned from that, and what he carried forward through 969 years to his grandson Noah, is a thread that runs through the rest of this story in ways we will return to. But for now, stay with the outside view a little longer. Because there is one more thing the outside view of Enoch's 300 years gives us. And it is perhaps the most clarifying thing of all. He aged. Not in the way that sounds obvious. In a world where people lived for 9 centuries, the aging of 300 years looks different than it does in a world like ours. But 300 years is still 300 years of a body living in time, accumulating the evidence of all it has been through. Enoch at 65, in the year Methuselah was born, and Enoch at 365, in whatever year his walk came to its completion, were not the same person in the physical sense. He had been marked by time the way everyone is marked by time, and the people around him, looking at the person he had become. He could see in that marking not just the passage of years, but the shape of how he had spent them. The direction he had walked in had left its evidence, not in supernatural signs or dramatic manifestations, in the quieter, more durable evidence of a character formed by 300 years of consistent orientation. A tree grown toward the light does not look like a tree that was never sure which direction the light was coming from. Enoch looked like a man who had been sure for 300 years. That was what the outside view showed. What the inside looked like was something else entirely. Chapter 5, 300 Years. From the inside. The text does not tell us whether Enoch felt lonely. That is the first thing to say. And it is important to say it clearly. We do not have his journals. We do not have letters he wrote to people he trusted. We do not have any record of what he said in the private hours of a life that stretched across 3 centuries. Genesis gives us his years and his direction and his ending, and it gives us almost nothing else. So what follows is not a claim about what Enoch experienced. It is an invitation to imagine, with the honesty that the text deserves and the humility that its silences require, what the inside of a life like his might have felt like. Not because imagining it is the same as knowing it, but because anyone who has ever tried to walk in one direction while their world moves in another knows the kind of interior landscape that this story opens toward. And most of us, if we are honest, know something of that landscape. Start with the simplest version of it. You are in a room full of people you love, people who know you, who have known you for years, who carry genuine affection for you and genuine interest in your life, and you are trying to say something true about the direction you have been walking, about what you have been learning, about the thing that has become the organizing center of your days. And you can feel, even as you speak, that the words are not landing the way you mean them, not because the people listening are hostile or dismissive, because they are oriented toward something else, because the frequency you are trying to broadcast on is one that, for whatever combination of reasons, they are not currently tuned to receive. You are not being rejected. You are not being attacked. You are simply not being fully understood. And the gap between what you are trying to say and what is being received is not a gap you can close by finding better words. It is a gap of direction. You are facing one way and they are facing another. And no amount of verbal precision can substitute for the shared orientation that would make the communication complete. That gap is uncomfortable in ways that are hard to describe without sounding dramatic. Because it is not dramatic, it is quiet. It is the kind of discomfort that does not announce itself, and does not resolve itself, and does not produce the kind of crisis that at least has the decency to be visible and therefore addressable. It is just there. Day after day, year after year, the small, persistent awareness that you are moving through the same world as the people around you, but not in the same direction. That you share their streets and their seasons and their ordinary human experiences, but not their deepest orientation. That you love them and they love you, and something essential about where you are going together in this life remains. Despite the love, not fully shared. Now multiply that by 300 years. That is what we are talking about when we talk about the inside of Enoch's walk with God. And here is what makes it harder than the simple version of loneliness that most people are familiar with. Enoch was not surrounded by people who opposed him. He was not a prophet in the wilderness, cut off from community, suffering the clean and comprehensible pain of visible rejection. He was embedded in the life of his world. He had family. He had relationships that spanned decades, and in some cases, centuries. He was known and present and genuinely part of the community he lived in. The loneliness was not the loneliness of exclusion. It was the loneliness of inclusion without full comprehension. Being inside the circle but carrying something the circle had not quite room for. Being loved by people who could not entirely follow where you were going. Being understood in all the ordinary ways. In your work and your humor and your grief and your daily habits. While the deepest thing about you remained, for most of the people who cared about you most, slightly out of reach. That is a specific kind of loneliness that is in some ways harder to bear than simple exclusion. Because exclusion at least gives you clarity. It tells you where you stand. The loneliness of imperfect inclusion gives you warmth and connection and the genuine goodness of being known, and then leaves a quiet gap at the center of it all that the warmth cannot quite fill. Enoch lived in that gap for 300 years. Not because the people around him were deficient, not because he was superior, simply because he was walking in a direction that required a kind of attention and a kind of orientation that the world around him was, in the aggregate, not maintaining. And the gap between his direction and his world's direction grew, not because he moved away from the world, but because the world continued moving in its own direction, while he continued moving in his. Now there is something else that the inside of 300 years contains. Something harder to name than loneliness, but just as present. Call it the weight of sustained conviction. There is a kind of faith that is easy in its early stages. The early stages of any genuine spiritual awakening carry their own momentum. The newness of it. The clarity of seeing what you had not seen before. The energy of a direction recently chosen. All of that creates a kind of wind at your back that makes the walking feel natural, almost effortless. But 300 years is not the early stages. 300 years is the middle. The long, unseasonable, unspectacular middle of a commitment that was made before the middle arrived and will be completed after the middle ends. The middle does not have the energy of beginning or the clarity of ending. It has only itself, day after day of ordinary faithfulness, performed in ordinary circumstances, without the dramatic confirmation of a visible miracle or the energizing discomfort of a visible crisis. Just the walk. Just the daily choice to continue in the direction already chosen. And that choice, made small and quiet and mostly unremarkable across 3 centuries, is not a small thing. It is perhaps the largest thing a human being can do, because it requires something that the dramatic moments of faith do not require in the same way. It requires trusting, on the days when nothing visible confirms the trust, that the direction is real. That the one you are walking with is present even when the presence is not felt. That the distance you have traveled in this direction is meaningful even when nothing around you reflects that meaning back to you. The text says Enoch walked with God. It does not say Enoch always felt the presence of God. It does not say every day of those 300 years was luminous with divine encounter. It says he walked. And walking, as any honest person who has tried to maintain a genuine spiritual life across decades will tell you, includes the days when the walking feels like walking into nothing, when the silence is not peaceful but simply silent, when the direction you have chosen does not announce itself with warmth or confirmation but simply continues to be the direction you have chosen. On those days, you keep walking or you stop. Enoch kept walking. For 300 years, he kept walking. And here is the thing that the inside view reveals about what that produced in him. The thing that is hardest to articulate but most important to understand. It produced a kind of knowing that has no shorter name. Not the knowing of information, not the knowing of doctrine or theology or a set of propositions about the nature of God that can be listed and verified. The knowing that accumulates when you have been in close proximity to something for a very long time. The knowing that comes from 3 centuries of daily, ordinary, unremarkable attention to the same presence. The knowing of a person who has been in the same relationship long enough that the relationship has become part of the structure of their perception. You know the texture of a voice after 30 years of hearing it. You know the way a person moves through a room after decades of watching them. You know the particular quality of a silence between yourself and another person after enough years of shared silence to be able to read what it contains. Enoch, at the end of 300 years of walking with God, knew God the way that a very long and very faithful relationship produces knowing. Not perfectly, not without remainder or mystery or the irreducible gap that always exists between creature and creator, but deeply, genuinely, with the particular intimacy of a person who has shown up, day after day, in the same direction, for long enough that the showing up has become less an act of will and more a quality of who they are. The walk had become the walker. That is not a dramatic statement. It is almost the opposite of dramatic. It is the quiet, accumulated result of ordinary faithfulness practiced across an extraordinary span of time. And there is one more thing the inside view gives us. Perhaps the most uncomfortable thing, the thing that requires the most honesty to sit with. Enoch knew what his son's name meant. He had given Methuselah that name himself. He had pressed into the identity of his firstborn child a compressed statement about the patience and the judgment of the God he walked with. And every time he heard that name spoken, every time he called his son to dinner, or watched him grow, or held him in grief, or celebrated him in joy, he heard the echo of what the name contained. When he dies, something will come. The father who loved his son was also the man who had named his son after the judgment that his son's death would release. The man who walked with God had walked closely enough to understand that the patience embedded in his son's long life was real patience, genuinely extended, genuinely open, and that it would not extend forever. He held both of those things, the love and the weight of what the love was surrounded by, the joy of a child and a family and 300 years of ordinary human goodness, and the knowledge that the world in which all of that goodness was being lived out was heading somewhere that goodness alone could not prevent. He held both, without letting the weight of the second crush the reality of the first, without letting the reality of the first blind him to the weight of the second. That is perhaps the most human thing about Enoch's 300 years. Not the extraordinary length of the walk, not the intimacy with God that the walk produced. The capacity, maintained across all those years, to hold the grief and the love at the same time, to keep loving a world that was heading somewhere grievous, to keep walking toward God in a world that was walking away from Him, to stay. That is what walking with God looked like from the inside. Not a state of achieved peace above the fray, a daily, costly, deeply human staying in the world, with the grief, alongside the people you love, in the direction you have chosen. For as long as you are given, 300 years, he stayed. Chapter 6. The world that no longer looked up. There is a difference between a world that has chosen darkness and a world that has forgotten light. The difference matters more than it might initially seem, and getting it wrong distorts everything that follows. Because the world before the flood, as Genesis describes it, was not primarily a world of people making dramatic decisions to reject God. It was not a world populated by villains with speeches, sitting in rooms, and deliberately choosing corruption with clear-eyed malice. It was something more ordinary than that, and something more frightening. Genesis 6 does not give us cartoon evil. It gives us this. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Every intention, only evil, continually. Those are not the words of a world that made one bad decision. They are the words of a world whose inner compass had been reoriented so completely and for so long that the reorientation had become the nature, the default. The thing that happened without effort or intention, because it had been happening for long enough to stop requiring either. That is not how you describe a rebellion. That is how you describe a drift. A river does not decide to change course. It follows the path of least resistance, year after year, cutting a little deeper into the same channel, until the channel has become so established that the river cannot imagine flowing any other way. The river does not choose the channel. It simply goes where the accumulated weight of its own history has made it easiest to go. The world before the flood had been drifting for a very long time. Now go back to Genesis 4. Back to the sentence we paused on in the first chapter. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Began. We noted the significance of that word before, but now it is worth going further. Because that sentence, placed where it is in the narrative, is not just describing a religious revival in the days of Enoch. It is describing the starting point of a long and losing battle against a current that was already running in the other direction. The people of Seth's line had to begin calling on the name of God because the not calling had already started. The effort to reorient had to be deliberate because the drift away from orientation was already in motion. And deliberate effort, maintained against a current, is exhausting in a way that simply flowing with the current is not. Across the generations that followed, from Enoch to Kenan to Mahalalel to Jared to Enoch, the effort continued. The thread was passed forward. But the current was also continuing. And the current was not fighting. The current was simply being what currents are: patient, persistent, and relentlessly following the path that generations of accumulated momentum had worn into the landscape. By the time Enoch was walking, the balance had shifted. Not completely, not yet. The thread was still being passed. There were still people, in Seth's line and perhaps elsewhere, who were making the deliberate effort to orient themselves against the current. Enoch was one of them, and in his case, the orientation had deepened into something that 3 centuries of faithful walking had made structural rather than effortful. But the world around him had not. And as Enoch moved deeper into his 2nd century of walking, and then his 3rd, the world around him was not staying still while he walked. It was continuing to drift, each generation inheriting the drift of the one before it and adding to it. The way interest compounds on a debt that is never paid down. Not dramatically. Not in a single identifiable moment when everyone recognized the point of no return. Just steadily. Just persistently. Just the way things drift, when there is nothing strong enough and consistent enough to hold them against the current. Genesis 6 describes what the end point of that drift looked like. The earth was corrupt in God's sight. The earth was filled with violence. God looked on the earth and saw that it was corrupt. For all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. 3 times in a handful of verses, the same word returns. Corrupt. Corrupted. Corruption. Not a local problem. Not corruption in one region or one generation. The earth. All flesh. The repetition is the text's way of saying this is what the whole direction has produced. This is where the drift arrives when it is allowed to run long enough without interruption. Now here is where we need to be careful about something. The world that Genesis 6 describes was not a world that had never been offered anything else. It was not a world that had drifted in ignorance, without any thread running against the current, without any voice or life or presence pointing in a different direction. Enoch had been in that world for 300 years, walking in the other direction, not hiding, not silent, present in the full human sense, embedded in the community, raising children. Who would raise children? Who would raise the man who built the ark? Not a distant symbol, but a daily, visible, 300-year argument in human form that the direction the world was choosing was not the only direction available. We should not say, because the text does not say, that Enoch stood in the marketplace and preached. We should not claim, because Genesis does not claim, that he was a prophet in the formal sense, delivering oracles and calling nations to repentance. What the text gives us is simpler and in some ways more radical than that. It gives us a life that said, by its very existence and its sustained direction, that the drift was not inevitable, that a human being could live inside the same world, breathe the same air, face the same losses and the same daily ordinary demands, and still maintain an orientation toward the thing the world around them was forgetting. Not perfectly, not without cost, but actually and genuinely and across 300 years without stopping. Later tradition remembered Enoch as a man who saw the direction of history more clearly than the people around him. Whether that memory is precise, or whether it is the natural amplification that accumulates around figures whose lives have taken on symbolic weight, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that the structure of the story places him at the end of a world that is forgetting, and has him depart before the forgetting becomes final. He was not there when the flood came. His son was Methuselah, whose name had always pointed toward the moment of his death, as the moment something long held would be released. Lived 969 years. The year he died, by the arithmetic of Genesis, was the year the waters came. The longest human life in the record of Scripture ended in the same year as the world it had witnessed. Enoch did not live to see that, but he named it. He pressed it into the identity of his firstborn child, before the child could speak or walk or understand what he was being named after. Before the 300 years of walking had accumulated their weight, before the world had arrived at the destination it was heading toward. He saw the direction, and he named his son after where the direction was going. There is a kind of love in that naming that is difficult to hold alongside the grief it contains. Because naming your child after judgment is not an act of pessimism or despair. It is an act of honesty, and honesty in the face of something terrible is its own form of love. It says, I will not pretend the direction is other than what it is. I will not protect myself from the knowledge of where this is heading by refusing to speak it plainly. I will speak it plainly, and then I will walk with God anyway. That is what Enoch did. For 300 years, in a world that was no longer looking up, he kept looking up. Not because it was easy. The world did not make it easy. The drift did not pause out of respect for the man walking against it. The forgetting did not slow down in deference to the one who was refusing to forget. The world continued being what it was becoming, and Enoch continued being what he was becoming. Two directions. One world. 300 years of the space between them widening without either side declaring a crisis. Because the widening was too gradual and too ordinary to announce itself as the disaster it was accumulating toward. And through all of it, Methuselah was alive, growing older, living his extraordinary length of years, carrying a name that the world around him spoke every day without pausing to hear what it was saying, being, without knowing the full weight of it, the living measure of the patience being extended to a world that was spending every year of that patience continuing in the direction it had chosen. Enoch understood that. He had understood it from the year he pressed that name into his son's identity. And he kept walking. The world that no longer looked up continued not looking up. and the man who had been looking up for 300 years was running out of years. Not because the years had been cut short, because the circle had been running its course since the year Methuselah was born. And 300 years is a full orbit, and full orbits complete themselves. The ending was not approaching. It was arriving. Chapter 7. When silence was not enough. Genesis gives us 5 verses about Enoch. 5 verses. For a man who walked with God for 300 years. For a man whose departure from the world broke a pattern that the text had spent 6 entries establishing. For a man whose son would live to the edge of the flood, and whose grandson would carry the living world through it. The entirety of what Genesis records directly is 5 verses. Count them if you want. They are right there in Genesis chapter 5. Verses 21 through 24. A birth, a number, a phrase repeated twice, and an ending unlike any other ending in the chapter. 5 verses. And for centuries, that was not enough. Not because people doubted what the 5 verses said, not because the account was unclear, or the theology confused, or the language ambiguous in ways that demanded correction. The 5 verses are remarkably clear for what they say. The problem was not what they said. The problem was what they did not say. They did not say what Enoch saw during 300 years of walking with God. They did not say what he knew, or what he was shown, or what the experience of sustained proximity to the divine had revealed to a man who maintained that proximity longer than any other recorded human being. They did not say what it felt like, from the inside, to be the person in a genealogy of death who did not die. They did not say where he went, or what he encountered, or what the transition from here to not here involved. They said he walked with God and was not, and the silence around those words was enormous. Not the comfortable silence of a mystery that has been accepted and set aside. The active, pressing silence of a space that feels like it should contain more than it does. The silence of a sentence that opens a door and then offers no description of what is on the other side. For centuries, that silence was unbearable. Not because people doubted what Genesis said, but because 5 verses about a man who walked with God felt less like a complete account and more like the beginning of a conversation that had never been finished. And so, in the tradition that grew up around those 5 verses, across the centuries following the composition of Genesis, people tried to finish it. They tried to fill the silence with something worthy of the space it occupied. What they produced was the tradition of Enoch. The most significant document in that tradition is the collection of texts known as First Enoch, sometimes called the Book of Enoch or the Ethiopic Book of Enoch. Before we enter what it contains, a word about what it is, because precision here matters. First, Enoch is not a single book written by a single author at a single moment. It is a collection of texts, composed over several centuries, probably between the 3rd century and the 1st century before the Common Era. It is not part of the Hebrew Bible. It is not part of the Protestant Old Testament. It is not part of the Catholic or Eastern Orthodox canon in the form that most Western readers would recognize. It is, however, canonical scripture in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, which is one of the oldest continuous Christian communities in the world. And it was widely read and highly regarded in Jewish communities in the centuries immediately before and after the time of Jesus. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the caves above Qumran in 1947, contained fragments of First Enoch in the original Aramaic, confirming that the text was being read, copied, and preserved by serious Jewish communities in the 1st century before the Common Era. What First Enoch contains is an attempt to answer the questions that Genesis 5 did not. The opening sections describe a cataclysm that provides the backstory to the world of Noah. A group of divine beings, called Watchers, descended from their proper place and took human women as wives, producing giant offspring called the Nephilim. They taught humanity forbidden knowledge, the arts of war and sorcery, and the manipulation of natural forces in ways that accelerated the corruption of the world. The resulting violence and disorder prompted the divine judgment that Genesis 6 would record. And in the middle of all of this, Enoch appears, not as a passive observer, but as the one figure who moved between worlds, a righteous man in a generation given over to the consequences of what the Watchers had done. He was taken up into the presence of God, shown the structure of the heavens and the movements of the stars, and the chambers where judgment is prepared, and the place where the souls of the righteous wait. He was given visions of the end of history and the final accounting. He was sent back with messages for the Watchers who had sinned, pronouncing their judgment and the judgment of their offspring. He was, in the tradition of first Enoch, a prophet of cosmic scope, a scribe of righteousness, a man who stood at the boundary between the human and the divine and carried words in both directions. Now, why does this matter for understanding the Enoch of Genesis? It matters because of the question it raises. And the question it raises is worth sitting with honestly. Why Enoch? Of all the figures in the pre-flood world, of all the characters in the genealogy of Seth, why did generations of Jewish writers, serious and learned men who knew their scriptures deeply, choose this particular man to carry the weight of apocalyptic vision and cosmic prophecy? The answer, if you look for it, is already in Genesis. He walked with God. In a world that was no longer looking up, he kept looking up, in a chapter full of men who lived and died and left no record of having turned in any particular direction. He was the one the text identified by his relationship with God, rather than by his achievements or his descendants or his years. He was the one whose end broke the pattern. He was the one who was not, because God took him. If any human being had access to what ordinary human beings could not see, the tradition reasoned, it was the man who had spent 300 years in the company of the one who sees everything. If any human being could carry a word from beyond the edge of human experience, it was the man who had already crossed that edge. The tradition did not invent Enoch's significance. It followed it, from the 5 verses that Genesis provided, into the space that those 5 verses opened without filling. And the tradition was large. Fragments of first Enoch appear to have circulated widely enough that the authors of the New Testament were familiar with them. The letter of Jude, in the New Testament, contains a direct quotation that it attributes to Enoch, the 7th from Adam. Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones, to execute judgment on all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him. The letter of Jude attributes these words to Enoch. The passage appears in 1 Enoch, and Jude, writing to a first-century Christian community, cites it as authoritative testimony about the character of the coming judgment. This requires care. The fact that Jude cites or echoes a tradition found in 1 Enoch does not automatically make the entire book of Enoch canonical for all Christian traditions. The authors of the New Testament quoted from and alluded to a wide range of texts, some of which were canonical scripture and some of which were part of the broader literary and religious culture of their world. Jude's use of the Enoch tradition tells us that the tradition was known, was respected, and contained material that a New Testament author found worth citing in the context of warning about judgment. It does not tell us that everything in 1 Enoch carries the same weight as Genesis. What it does tell us is that the tradition of Enoch was not peripheral. It was not a fringe curiosity preserved by an eccentric minority. It was part of the living religious imagination of the communities that produced the New Testament. The man from Genesis 5, the man with 5 verses to his name, had become by the 1st century a figure of cosmic significance in the tradition that surrounded and shaped the world Jesus and his followers inhabited. The size of the tradition tells us something about the size of the absence. 5 verses opened a space. Centuries of serious religious imagination tried to fill it. The tradition that grew up in that space was not uniform or internally consistent, and it should not be approached as if it were a single authoritative document with the same standing as the texts of the Hebrew Bible. But it should not be dismissed either. It should be understood for what it is: an extended act of wonder. A community of careful, faithful, seriously minded people encountering the silence of Genesis around Enoch and refusing to simply let that silence lie, asking the questions that the silence invited, imagining the answers that the questions seemed to require, building, across centuries of reflection and composition, a portrait of a man whose 5 verses in Genesis had convinced them that there was more to his story than 5 verses could hold. They were probably right about that. The man who walked with God for 300 years, in a world that was no longer looking up, while carrying a name that compressed the whole weight of coming judgment into the identity of his firstborn son, and who was then simply not, because God took him, was not a man whose story fits comfortably into 5 verses. The tradition was not wrong to feel the pressure of that inadequacy. It was wrong, occasionally, in the specific things it invented to relieve the pressure. Some of the material in 1st Enoch reflects the particular concerns and anxieties of its own historical moment, rather than anything that can be traced to the Enoch of Genesis. The Watchers and the Nephilim and the fallen angels and the chambers of judgment may tell us more about the fears of 2nd century Jewish communities living under Hellenistic pressure than about the man who fathered Methuselah. But the impulse behind the tradition was correct. There is more here than 5 verses can hold. There is a man who spent 300 years in the company of God, in a world that was drifting toward judgment, carrying the weight of what he knew about where the drift was heading without putting it down and without walking away from the walk. A man whose life was its own form of prophecy, not in the sense of speeches delivered in public, but in the sense of a direction maintained across centuries that stood as a living argument against the direction the world had chosen. The Book of Enoch tried to describe what that man might have seen. What it could not fully capture was what it actually cost him to keep walking. We spent 2 chapters trying to approach that. The tradition of Enoch spent centuries trying to approach it differently. Neither attempt exhausts the subject. And that is exactly what you would expect from 5 verses written about a man who walked with God. Chapter 8, and he was not. We have been building toward this sentence for a long time. Not just in this telling. In the entire tradition of careful reading that surrounds Enoch, in the centuries of Jewish and Christian reflection that tried to fill the silence of Genesis, in the Book of Enoch, and the letters of the New Testament, and the quiet debates of scholars across 2,000 years of attempting to understand what happened at the end of one man's 300 years of walking. All of it has been building toward 4 words. And he was not. You heard those words at the beginning of this story. In the cold open, before you knew anything about the world Enoch was born into, or the year his son arrived, or what 300 years of walking in one direction, while the world walked in another, actually costs a person from the inside. You heard them then as mystery, as the hook of a story not yet told. Hear them now. And he was not. Now you know the world he was born into. A world sophisticated enough and old enough to have started forgetting what it was built on, drifting not with dramatic intention, but with the quiet momentum of generations, each inheriting the drift of the one before, and adding to it. Now you know the 65 years of ordinary life before Methuselah arrived. The years the text does not record, because nothing in them had yet required recording. The years of a man carrying a thread he had not yet been asked to pull. Now you know the year everything changed. The morning a child arrived and a father looked into that child's face and turned in a direction he would not turn away from for the rest of his life. The name pressed into the child's identity before the child could understand it. The motif of 365 already implied in the year the circle began its closing arc. Now you know 300 years from the outside. the accumulated evidence of a character formed by consistent orientation, the quiet signature of a man who had been walking with someone for so long that the walking had become the grain of him. Now you know 300 years from the inside. The specific quality of loneliness that belongs to a person who loves their world and cannot fully be understood by it. The weight of sustained conviction on the days when nothing visible confirms the conviction. The daily choosing to continue that compounds across centuries into something that no single dramatic act of faith can replicate. Now you know the world that was no longer looking up. The drift that was not a decision but an accumulated direction, running deeper with every generation, filling every channel the world offered, until the corruption was not a feature of the world, but the nature of it. Now you know the tradition that grew up around the silence of those 5 verses. The centuries of serious imagination that tried to fill the space Genesis left open. The book of Enoch and the Watchers and the letter of Jude and the portrait of a man who moved between worlds, because the world he lived in had convinced a tradition that a man who walked with God that long could not possibly have stayed on only one side of the threshold between the human and the divine. You know all of that now. And now read the sentence again. And Enoch walked with God. And he was not. For God took him. It does not land the same way it did at the beginning. At the beginning it was strange. An anomaly in a pattern. A curiosity demanding explanation. Now it is something else. Now it is a conclusion. Not the conclusion of a miracle imposed on an ordinary life from the outside. The conclusion of a life that had been moving toward this particular ending for 300 years. A life that had been shaped, step by ordinary step, into something that the ordinary ending of an ordinary life did not quite fit. He was not. The text does not say he died. Every other entry in Genesis 5 says he died. The phrase is there, consistent and unbroken. And he died. And he died. For every other name in the chapter. For Enoch, the phrase is not there. Something else is there instead. Something so quiet and so unlike the surrounding language that a careless reader will miss the difference entirely. He was not. He was not here anymore. He was not where he had been. He was not findable by the ordinary means by which the living locate each other in the world of the living. He was simply and completely and without the usual ceremony of departure. Not. For God took him. Not he ascended. Not he was transported. Not he underwent a transformation of some dramatic and observable kind. God took him. The active verb belongs to God, and the action it describes is left without further description. There is no account of what the taking looked like. No description of a moment or a place or a manner. No witnesses named. No sound recorded. No light described. Just the taking, and the absence that followed it. Now here is where the comparison with Elijah becomes important, because Elijah is the figure that almost every reader reaches for when they try to understand Enoch's departure. 2 men, both taken without dying in the ordinary sense. 2 precedents in Scripture for a departure that does not follow the usual pattern, but set them side by side carefully, not to find their similarities, to find their differences. Elijah's departure is one of the most dramatic scenes in the Hebrew Bible. Elisha is watching. He has been watching for the entire journey. He refuses to leave Elijah's side, even when Elijah asks him to stay behind. He is present, deliberate, witnessing, committed to seeing whatever is going to happen. And what happens is visible and loud and extraordinary in the most literal sense. A chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the 2 of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. Fire, horses, chariot, whirlwind, heaven. There are witnesses. There is drama. There is a mantle that falls. A symbolic transfer of power. A public moment of succession that ensures the ministry continues. Elisha tears his clothes. The company of prophets sees it from a distance and bows to the ground. The departure of Elijah interrupts a prophetic ministry in progress and provides it with a visible, memorable, theologically loaded conclusion. Elijah's departure is a scene. Now go back to Enoch. No witnesses named, no fire, no chariot, no whirlwind, no mantle falling, no company of observers bowing at a distance, no tearing of clothes, no described moment of transition, no scene, just a sentence in a genealogy. He walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Elijah's departure interrupts a story. It breaks into the middle of a narrative that has been building for chapters, with named characters and specific geography and dramatic stakes, and it provides that narrative with a climax worthy of everything that has been building toward it. Enoch's departure interrupts a death toll. It breaks the rhythm of a genealogy, not a narrative. It does not arrive in the middle of a story about Enoch because there is no story about Enoch. Only the genealogy. It does not provide a climax because there is no build-up in the narrative sense. There is only the list, and the pattern breaking, and the silence where the explanation should be. Elijah was taken in fire, with a prophet watching. Enoch was taken in silence, with no one named as witness. Elijah's departure is seen, Enoch's departure is written, and that distinction between the departure that is witnessed and described and the departure that is only recorded in the passive language of a genealogy may be why Enoch is stranger than Elijah. Not more significant, not more theologically weighty, but stranger, more unsettling to sit with, more resistant to the kind of understanding that a dramatic scene allows. Because a scene can be processed, a scene has the mercy of being finite. It begins and it progresses and it ends. And when it ends, you know what you have seen, and you can begin the work of understanding it. The sentence about Enoch does not end in that way. It opens, and he was not, for God took him. That sentence opens onto a silence that does not resolve. It points towards something that cannot be described because the text has decided, with the quiet confidence of a writer who knows exactly what they are doing, that the silence is the description, that the absence of explanation is itself the most accurate thing that can be said about what happened. We do not know what the taking looked like. We do not know if there was a moment, a specific ordinary afternoon or morning or evening, when Enoch was walking and then was simply not walking. We do not know if anyone was nearby. We do not know if there was any perceptible transition, or whether the world simply contained him in one moment and did not contain him in the next. We do not know any of that. And the text, very deliberately, does not tell us. Because the point is not the mechanics of the departure. The mechanics would be a distraction from what the departure means. And what the departure means is inseparable from the life that preceded it. Not a miracle appended to an ordinary life from the outside. The completion of a life that had been orienting itself toward this particular ending for 300 years. He walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Read those 3 clauses and feel how they connect. The walking is the explanation of the not. He was not here because he had been moving toward not here for 300 years. The direction he had been walking in led, as every sustained direction eventually leads somewhere, to the place that direction was always heading toward. He did not arrive there by accident. He arrived there because he kept walking, and God took him. The taking is not a reward. The text does not frame it as a prize for good behavior or the payoff of a transaction between a faithful man and a pleased God. The taking is the completion of the walk. The natural conclusion of 300 years of moving in one direction, the moment when the distance between where Enoch was and where Enoch had been walking toward had closed to nothing. He got there, not by crossing some dramatic threshold with a fanfare of fire and horses, by walking, ordinary, daily, one step at a time. 300 years of walking, the same kind of walking that anyone can do, in any world, in any generation, regardless of whether fire and horses attend the effort. Just walking in the right direction for long enough. And now here is the thing that the emotional peak of this chapter is meant to produce. Not as a theological argument, but as a felt recognition. You came into this story at the cold open with a question. What kind of life ends like that? You have now spent 8 chapters watching the answer build. Not in the form of a list of virtues or a catalog of achievements or a dramatic series of spiritual victories. In the form of a life, an ordinary human life, born into an ordinary world, shaped by ordinary relationships and ordinary losses, and the ordinary daily choosing that makes any life what it is. The answer to the question is not complicated. The kind of life that ends like that is a life that was already going in that direction. A life that, from the year a child was born, and a name was given, and a man turned and began walking, had been consistently, persistently, without dramatic declaration or visible fanfare, moving toward the one it was walking with. He was not taken because he was perfect. He was not taken because he was the greatest man of his generation, or because his faith was stronger than everyone else's, or because he had achieved some threshold of spiritual merit that entitled him to a different ending. He was taken because he kept walking. 300 years of keeping walking, in a world that had largely stopped, produced a person whose direction and whose destination had become, in some deep and irreversible sense, the same thing. The walk and the walker. The direction and the person walking in it. And when God took him, there was no dramatic scene, no fire and no chariot, and no witnesses bowing at a distance. Just the quiet completion of something that had been in motion for 300 years. Just a sentence in a genealogy. Just a silence where the explanation should be. And he was not. For God took him. Chapter 9. What he left behind. There is no grave. That is the first thing to say. And it is worth saying plainly before anything else. Every patriarch in Genesis 5 left something behind that could be returned to. A location. A fixed point in the landscape of the living where the dead could be acknowledged and remembered and grieved. The world of Genesis was not a world that buried its dead carelessly. The grave mattered. It was the evidence that a person had been here, had occupied a specific piece of the earth, had ended in a specific place that could be named and found, and stood beside by the people who needed to stand beside something when the person was gone. Abraham would buy a cave in Hebron to bury Sarah, and the transaction would take up more verses in Genesis than Enoch's entire life. Jacob would make his sons swear to carry his bones out of Egypt and bury him in the land of his fathers. Rachel would be buried on the road to Bethlehem, and the pillar that marked her grave would still be standing centuries later. The dead, in Genesis, leave addresses. Enoch left no address. Not because he was forgotten or unmourned or treated as less than the others, but because there was nothing to bury. No body, no location, no stone to mark the place where the presence ended and the absence began. The transition from here to not here left no residue in the geography of the world he had inhabited. You cannot go back to where Enoch is. There is no where. And that absence, that specific and unusual absence of a grave, is not incidental to what Enoch left behind. It is the first and most visible part of it. Because a grave is a kind of anchor. It holds the memory of a person to a specific location, and in doing so it also, subtly, holds the significance of that person within the boundaries of a place and a time. The grave says, here is where this ended. Here is the final address. Here is where you come when you need to locate what this person was. Enoch's ending has no anchor. His significance cannot be located in a place because it was never primarily located in a place. It was located in a direction, in a walk, in 300 years of consistent movement toward the one he was walking with, and when that walk was completed, there was nothing left to bury because what he was had gone where he was going. He did not leave a grave. He left a direction. And that direction, it turns out, was not carried away when he was taken. It remained in the world, not as an institution or a monument or a set of written teachings that could be studied and debated. As something harder to quantify and more durable than any of those things, it remained in a household. It remained in a son who had grown up watching his father walk, day after day and year after year, in a direction that the world outside their household was not walking. A son who had absorbed, through the long proximity of shared daily life, the texture of a walk he had never been able to fully articulate, but had never been able to forget either. Methuselah, the son whose name already carried the weight of what was coming, the son who had been living inside the meaning of that name for 969 years, when the year the name pointed toward finally arrived. The son who had grown up in Enoch's household and outlived his father by nearly a millennium, carrying forward in his own life and in the lives of his descendants something that Enoch had pressed into the grain of their family before he was taken. We do not know exactly what Methuselah believed, or how much of his father's walk he maintained across those 9 centuries. The text is, characteristically, silent on that. What the text gives us instead is arithmetic. Methuselah had a son named Lamech. Lamech had a son named Noah. Noah walked with God. The same phrase. The phrase that had not appeared in the genealogy since Enoch. The phrase that marked Enoch as different from every other name in the chapter suddenly appears again. 3 generations later, attached to the man who would build the ark and carry the living world through the waters, Noah walked with God. That is not an accident of language. In a text as deliberate as Genesis, the repetition of a specific phrase across generations is not casual. It is the text telling you something about continuity, about what was passed forward, about the thread that did not break even when the world around it was running out of thread. The walk that Enoch began in the year Methuselah was born did not end when Enoch was taken. It continued through Methuselah, who carried it for 969 years, in the form of a name and a household, and whatever it means to have grown up as the son of a man who walked with God, through Lamech, who looked at his newborn son and said, "This one will bring relief from the painful toil of our hands," speaking with the particular conviction of a man who had received something real enough to pass forward, even in a world that had largely stopped receiving it, through Noah, who in a generation that Genesis 6 describes as comprehensively and irreversibly corrupt, maintained the same quality of relationship with God that his great-grandfather had maintained for 300 years. The walk was the inheritance, not land, not wealth, not a formal religious institution with buildings and offices and a succession plan. A vok, a direction, a way of moving through the world that was passed from a father to a son, to a son, to a son, across 4 generations and several centuries, through the long darkening of a world heading toward judgment, until it reached the man who would be given the task of carrying life through the judgment. Enoch did not save the world, but he raised. Through the chain of faithfulness he initiated. The man who did. That is what the grave could never have held. That is what no stone marker or named location could have preserved. The direction, the walk, the quiet, persistent, 300-year argument in human form that it was possible to live inside a world that was forgetting and to choose not to forget. That it was possible to walk with God in a generation that had stopped looking up, that the drift was not the destiny. Noah proved that argument true. He proved it in wood and labor, and the daily unremarkable faithfulness of a man who built what he was asked to build in a world that found the building incomprehensible. He proved it in the same way his great-grandfather had proven it, not with a dramatic speech or a public declaration or a moment of visible triumph, but with a walk, day after day, in the same direction, for long enough that the direction became the thing the life was made of. He was not taken the way Enoch was taken. He walked out of the ark onto dry ground after the waters receded, and he lived 350 more years. And then he died the way everyone else in Genesis died. He was not an exception to the pattern, the way Enoch was an exception to the pattern. But the pattern he carried in him, the pattern of the walk, the direction that Enoch had turned toward in the year Methuselah was born and never turned away from, that pattern survived the flood. It came through the waters in the person of the man who had received it, through the long chain of ordinary faithfulness, from a great-grandfather he had likely never met. Enoch was taken before Noah was born. But Enoch was present in Noah in the way that the deepest inheritances are present, not as memory or doctrine or formal tradition, but as something closer to instinct, a way of standing in the world that had been shaped, before Noah arrived, by the accumulated weight of 3 generations living in the direction that Enoch had first chosen. That is the inheritance that has no grave. That is what he left behind. Now here is where we have to come down from the sweep of the historical and the theological and sit with something smaller and more personal. Because this story, for all its extraordinary scale, is finally about something that belongs to everyone. Not everyone will live 365 years. Not everyone will be taken the way Enoch was taken, departed without dying, removed from the world in the quiet language of a sentence that breaks a pattern that seemed unbreakable. That is not the point. The point is the walk. The walk is available to anyone, not the outcome, not the departure without dying, not the 5 verses in a genealogy that have generated 2,000 years of tradition and wonder and careful reflection. Those belong to Enoch specifically, to his particular place, in a particular story, at a particular moment in the history of a world that was heading toward judgment. But the walk, the daily, ordinary, unspectacular practice of moving through the world in a specific direction, of choosing, on the unremarkable Tuesday mornings when nothing confirms the choice and nothing dramatic requires it, and the drift of everything around you suggests that the choice does not particularly matter. To keep walking in the direction you have chosen, of allowing that choice, made small and quietly and without audience for long enough, to become less a decision you make and more a quality of who you are. That is available. That has always been available. It was available to the people who lived beside Enoch for 300 years and mostly did not take it. It is available to anyone reading or listening to this account who recognizes in the specific shape of Enoch's loneliness, the specific shape of their own. Anyone who has felt the gap between the direction they are trying to walk in and the direction the world around them is moving. Anyone who has carried something they could not fully explain to the people who love them most. Anyone who has faced the long and unseasonable middle of a commitment made before the middle arrived and wondered whether the walking is accomplishing anything that could be measured or verified or pointed to as evidence that the direction is real. Enoch did not leave behind a grave. He left behind a direction. And the question is not whether you will be taken the way he was taken. The question is whether the life you are living has a direction, or whether it is only movement. Because movement and walking are not the same thing. Movement is what happens when you are carried by the current, when the accumulated momentum of the world around you, the drift of the generation you were born into, the path of least resistance, worn smooth by everyone who came before you, simply takes you where it takes you without requiring any particular orientation on your part. Movement does not need a direction. It only needs momentum. Walking is different. Walking requires a direction. Walking requires the daily, mostly unremarkable choice to face a specific way and put one foot in front of the other in that direction rather than any other. Walking does not require certainty about the destination. It does not require the reassurance of visible progress or the confirmation of dramatic signs. It requires only the direction and the choosing to continue in it. Enoch walked. In a world that was moving, in a generation that had stopped looking up, in 300 years that contained all the ordinary human material that 300 years contains. He walked. Not perfectly, Not without the accumulated weight of what walking through a world heading the wrong direction for 300 years costs a person. But actually, really, in a direction that was not the direction of the current. And the walk became the life, and the life became the inheritance. And the inheritance crossed the flood in the person of a great-grandson who never met him. And here we are, thousands of years later, still with the same question that the 5 verses have always generated. The question you came into this story with, and that this story has been turning over from every available angle. What kind of life ends like that? You know the answer now. Not because you have been given a formula or a program or a set of steps that will produce the same ending for you, but because you have sat with the life long enough to feel the shape of it, long enough to recognize what was at the center of it, long enough to understand that the ending was not imposed on the life from the outside, but grew out of the inside of the life itself. From 300 years of daily ordinary choosing to keep walking in the direction chosen. The kind of life that ends like that is a life that was already going in that direction. A life with a direction. Not just movement. A valk. Not just the current. Not a grave. A valk. That is what Enoch left behind. That is what is still available.